The Bible has enthralled peoples of many different cultures for centuries. The Bible is more than just a single book. It's actually a collection of multiple texts. The ancients referred to them as simply the books, or ta Biblia in Greek. This peculiar title originated from the strong belief that the Bible is a sacred text, inspired and revealed by God Himself. A text unique in its kind. It is dramatically different from all other religious texts. The Bible commands our fascination with its incredible mystique, a mystery associated with the very essence of God. The Bible originated among a people living in the Middle East more than 3,500 years ago, the Jews. It is through the history of this people that God revealed Himself to mankind. This is why, in the Bible, the truth about God is not based on myths or philosophies, but on the authentic history of a people, a history to be studied and understood. This history begins with the life of Abraham. The book of Genesis reads, "So Abraham went, as the Lord had spoken unto him, and Lot went with him. At the age of 75, Abraham departed from Haran. And Abram took his wife Sarah, and Lot, his brother's son, and all their possessions that he could gather, and they embarked upon a journey into the land of Canaan." This is Haran today, the small town in southern Turkey from which Abraham set out for Palestine. The life of the patriarchs, the first Jews, became a common history of labor and earning. But it was also the history of a people certain of its single faith, a faith to be carefully observed and lovingly respected. Haran means journey. In the Bible, it is associated with the journey that led Terach, the father of Abraham, from his native town of Ur towards the north. From Haran, Abraham embarked with his entire family on a journey to Palestine. Today, this area between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers is where the town of Edessa, once known as Ufra, is located. To this day, for Muslims, this town represents notions of Abraham. Muslims believe, with certainty, that the ancient Ur is the town where the patriarch was born. It's widely believed that Abraham was born in a cavern, which has now become a shrine containing a sacred spring. One day, Abraham violently attacked the idols representing the sun and moon, and for doing so he was sentenced by the pitiless king to the stake, and the burning embers miraculously became transformed into fish. Muslims are convinced that these fish, swimming freely here today, are direct descendants of the miracle fish. They are worshipped with great care and are highly revered. Now let's set aside the world of legends and return to the aspects of real history and scientific research. Not too far away, south of Urfra, archaeologists discovered the ancient Haran, which, due to its notoriety as a station for caravans, was a relatively important town. In Abraham's time, Haran's popularity and reputation emanated directly from the shrine of the god Sin, represented by the moon. This god was also widely worshipped in Ur, the town from which Abraham's family came. It's also interesting to note that some of his relatives' names contain the word moon. As we can clearly see, these represent obvious connections to the god Sin. An Egyptologist, Breasted, discovered a name describing the entire region, which has now become notorious. He called it the Fertile Crescent. Turkey, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and Egypt. History, culture, and religion evolved on the fertile soil of this area, a marvelous point of embarkation for the dispersal of its bewildering force and countless discoveries throughout the centuries. In Egypt and Mesopotamia, a distinct transformation came over civilization as a whole. The development was spurred by a specific transpiration. People had always lived in small, stagnant communities of farmers and shepherds. Centralization of power created common cores of mutual interests. Commercial activities expanded by leaps and bounds, and an accompanying increase of needs and wealth ensued. In order to manage the handling of goods, the Sumerians created a form of writing. It is probably these people who should be thanked for such innovations as the discovery of the wheel and the art of turning pottery. The Sumerians eventually began to utilize writing in describing and recording past events. Their desire to influence the present and intentions of guiding the future enabled history to begin. Like the Sumerians, the Egyptians considered the world to be a great and marvelous place, created by superior forces, and they followed a precise order of behavior and activity. The beginning of history was formed and progressed along a planned track of a detailed religious outline, as civilization developed in a parallel course to religion. The banks of the Euphrates remind us to this day that the Jewish people originated and developed religiously and culturally among other peoples. During the times of the patriarchs, the Jews were strongly tied to Mesopotamia. For centuries, their history was handed down orally. Various written versions of their legacies were eventually produced, prior to 1000 BC. The result of these numerous textual volumes is the content of what is read today in the book of Genesis. It is justifiable for us to ask, does this book give us an historical information, or is it simply a collection of legends? Although that world, and those men and women who lived in it, may seem so distant from us, we do possess extensive information about them. This allows us to identify the style of language or literary genre, the precise nature of the content, as well as the actual historical significance of each story. The first Jews were shepherds. This detail can lead us instinctively to a very erroneous assumption and consideration. We might automatically associate humble shepherds in ancient times with notions of cultural backwardness. A wise question would be this: if a patriarch were living today, at what level of civilization would we consider him to belong? At a level like this? Or like this? The Bible speaks of Ur. It may be useful to see for ourselves what level of civilization was attained there in the historical times that we are now examining. Genesis guides us back to events referring to the history of a cultural environment that was composed of a remarkable human stature. In discovering the ruins of Ur, archaeologists exposed another key point. When historical sources speak of Ur, they speak of the truth. Ur really did exist, and we must admit that the existence of this town does not necessarily prove the existence of the patriarchs who lived in it. We must separate clues or indirect indications from direct findings. Consequently, regarding the patriarchs, we cannot make such assumptions as this was Abraham's house, or this was a tablet written by Jacob about himself. But it is reasonable to conclude that there is important evidence proving their actual existence. In life, it is important to learn about living intelligently with the darker side of things. For every form of knowledge, there is a limit beyond which it is impossible to transcend. Acknowledgement of such limits comprises the wisdom of those who can achieve a well-founded, albeit limited, knowledge. Resistance would necessarily entail a surrender to deliberate uncertainty. The fertile countryside of Mesopotamia. Light and color enhanced the generosity of this land, concealing the fierce powers of violence that made life precarious. First nature, then man, shook the environment and filled souls with uncertainty. The myths of creation were what provided order and security for the people of the time. The most interesting Babylonian text regarding creation is Enuma Elish. Priests would recite it each year, on New Year's Day. This poem's narration has a rapid dramatic rhythm. In the beginning were the god Apsu and the goddess Tiamat. They gave birth to various generations of deities. When the sixth generation became too boisterous, Tiamat declared war against them. Marduk was elected to lead the sons of the gods. He was victorious and broke Tiamat's body into two, creating the sky and the earth. He later created the planets and man. In a poem by Atrahasis, we are told that man was created for the purpose of replacing the inferior deities on heavier jobs. In the poem of Gilgamesh, we find the story of the flood. In comparison to these texts, the Bible's narration differs substantially. There aren't any stories about the birth of deities, or of polytheism in particular. While there may be similarities, such instances of apparent resemblance are only superficial. One common factor is that of the chaos of the beginning. But according to the Bible, this was caused by creation. If we consider the Egyptian texts from Heliopolis and Hermopolis, we can reach the same conclusions. Through myth, man has always attempted to understand the abstract structures of reality regarding the world, man, and divinity. The people of the Bible lived in this land and became immersed in its culture, using its language when necessary, but never adopting its ideas. The Jews managed to keep the purity of their faith intact, and when we read the stories of creation and how it all began, we can see that the Bible affirmed the language and images of myth, but it also distinctly resisted the polytheism typical to every myth, as well as to the deification of nature. The Bible's strict monotheism blocked the imaginative flow of divine stories. Indeed, it admitted only one sacred story, an authentic history which took place on earth and led man to salvation. The Jews experienced a unique occurrence in religious history. Faith was no longer born from man. The basis of religion was no longer the human sense of sacredness, but rather a direct revelation of God. God himself was now seeing man and providing his faith. It was a mystery that required deep understanding. This is a tome of Senefa, mayor of Thebes. The elder son is making offerings to his deceased parents. He is thus establishing a direct link with the earth, without which no life could be possible after death. God severely punished the Egyptians, who refused to free the Israelites, by killing their firstborn sons, and thus denying the dead their link with the earth, and abandoning them. Ancient Egyptians believed that after death, life continued in exactly the same way. They thought it might be even better. It was considered sufficient to carefully invest personal effects in a beautiful eternal residence dedicated to the greatest opportunities of joy, pleasure, love, and honor, This was why the most important economic investment for an Egyptian was the planning of his funeral and construction of his tomb. The tomb, with its frescoes, bas-reliefs, statuettes, and treasures, reproduced the kind of life they had dreamed of and pursued prior to death. A life comprised of slaves, friends, distractions, activities, and above all, celebration rites to the gods. When observing Egyptian tombs, we get the impression that we are facing an attempt to brand the world as man's exclusive, authentic paradise. In time, the contrast between the view of life and death, compared to the Bible's perspective, gradually became clearer. Here, people did not believe that life should be any different after death. It was meant to continue more richly and with more excitement than before. Here, man was content with the land, not seeking anything more, anything different. This form of paradise on earth actually fascinated the Jews for quite some time. When they were struck by famine, they in fact chose Egypt as their land. They lived there for centuries and accumulated a considerable fortune. But the mystery of God, which had initially won Abraham's heart, still engaged their conscience. It was in the land of Egypt that they found the greatest example of how useful the unity between man and God as a combined power could be. This union was the center of an intricate, though very solid and unquestionable general order. Above were the heavens and the gods. Directly connected with these were the pharaohs. Later, important personas at court also entered the supreme level of life. And at an inferior level, where the common people were, foreigners lived apart in an even more inferior condition. Throughout many centuries, Egyptian priests studied and defined this sacred order called Ma'at. Egyptian priests developed great rites. They created the impression that Egypt lived in unison with its gods in a unique system of life. By observing the course of the planets or studying dreams, they guided each Egyptian in learning and showing scrupulous respect for order. And thus everyone was promised a life of good deals and good fortune. The gods of Egypt, like the earlier deities of Mesopotamia or the later ones of Canaan, undoubtedly fascinated the Jewish people and also required respect and attention. But for the Jews, their fathers remained a living example of those who relentlessly continued along the path of authentic faith. Among the Jews, religion was reduced to extremely rational and comprehensible concepts. On one hand, myths told everything about the deities, while on the other hand, man's needs were always in the foreground, and thus each rite was clearly justified. So religion required cautious respect of custom, more than faith and inspiration. Jews maintained a completely different approach to what was sacred. The Bible suggested that man became a believer in every way. God was mystery. There were no stories describing the so-called private aspects of his life. Above all, this God made a distinction between earthly and unearthly objectives. Faith in the truth and in divine justice must have priority over everything, even over the necessities of life. It is by mere coincidence that the Bible often reminds us of God's demands that Israel leave Egypt. It is interesting to notice that in the desert, God asked Moses to discuss only his people's departure from the country with the Pharaoh. The idea was quite simple. It was a matter of producing a radical change in mentality and intense variation in the way of life. It was not enough just to make things better. They were to leave everything behind and head in a completely new direction. Biblical texts insist that Abraham could not stay in Mesopotamia, as also Moses could not stay in Egypt. This created an ideal bond of faith between Abraham and Moses, making the Jewish phenomenon a quest for God, in which sacredness was the real center, beyond any form of humanized sacredness or opportunistic superstition. On these aspects, Jewish religious texts differ quite radically from all other religious texts. In the Bible, each of God's revelations led to dismay and fear among those receiving. When in Bethel, God showed himself to Jacob in a dream. Jacob was at first quite shaken, but by the end of the revelation, he was mysteriously quite at ease with God. This experience traces the ideal path towards faith for every believer. Experiencing a revelation, overcoming those reactions that make us feel as if God is far away or is against us, attaining the complete confidence and love that make us feel naturally at ease with Him. Once they had left Egypt, the Jews were once again alone, more or less as they had been in the days of the patriarchs. But God was with them, even before they could notice or desire Him. The birth of Moses will always stay to remind us of this. A helpless infant, he was protected only by the force of Jehovah, who, along the waters of the Nile, led him as far as the house of the very Pharaoh who wanted all Jews to be killed. Here he was educated and lived to experience things which made him one of the most pivotal personas of the Old Testament. Before appearing as one, God wanted to reveal Himself as true. He did not think only of Himself. He preceded men, reached them and enlightened them. He loved them and honored them, encouraging them to take risks, demanding unconditional faith. Jehovah's hands were certainly no more merciful than those of Akhenaton's son, but there was quite a difference between the two. The transformation of the idea of God was accompanied by a surprising transformation of the notion of man. Around the world lived men who believed that they were themselves living gods, and they expected faith and worship. Their dictatorships held everyone in chains. God, on the other hand, marched the people forever forward, and this forward march continues to this day. So, unlike the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians, the Jews did not build any stairs that would lead them to the heavens. They began an alliance with God.